Master yourself, learn anything. 7 principles to learn anything faster than 99% of people. A woman sat in a language classroom watching classmates who had studied for 3 years struggle to order a coffee in the language they had spent hundreds of hours studying, while she, 6 months into her own study, held a full conversation with the instructor without hesitation. Nobody in that room understood how she had surpassed people with 5 times her experience until she finally explained her method during a break. She had not studied harder. She had not studied longer. She had studied differently, using 7 principles that had nothing to do with talent, and everything to do with how the mind actually absorbs anything worth knowing. These are those 7 principles, and the 7th one is the reason the other 6 actually work. 1. Struggle before answers builds deeper memory than answers before struggle. A mathematics student named Halden spent his early education relying entirely on solved examples, reading through worked problems until the steps felt familiar, believing this repetition was the same thing as understanding. He could follow along with any solution placed in front of him, but when faced with a new problem that did not match a pattern he had already memorized, he found himself completely lost, unable to generate a solution on his own despite having reviewed hundreds of similar examples. His grades reflected this gap consistently, strong on material he had already seen, weak on anything genuinely unfamiliar. A tutor, brought in after a particularly disappointing exam, changed Halden's entire approach within a single session. Instead of showing him another worked example, she gave him a problem slightly beyond his current ability, and told him to struggle with it for 20 minutes before she offered any help at all, no matter how frustrated he became, or how badly he wanted the answer handed to him. Halden hated this at first, certain it was a waste of time compared to simply being shown the correct method directly. But something happened during that struggle that passive reading had never produced. His mind, forced to actively search for a solution rather than passively absorb one, began forming connections between concepts that mere repetition had never required him to make. The tutor explained afterward that struggle, uncomfortable as it felt in the moment, activates a kind of learning that watching a solved example simply cannot replicate, because the brain remembers far more deeply what it had to fight for than what it received without effort. Halden began seeking out problems slightly beyond his comfort level deliberately, forcing himself to struggle before allowing himself to look up an answer or ask for help. It was slower at first, and far more frustrating than his old method of passive review. But within a single semester, his ability to solve genuinely new problems, the ones that could not be matched to a memorized pattern, improved dramatically, because he had spent months training his mind to generate solutions rather than simply recognize them. The discomfort of struggle is not a sign that learning is going wrong. It is very often the exact sensation of learning happening as deeply as it possibly can. 2. Teaching someone else reveals exactly where your own understanding is incomplete. A medical student named Adeline believed she understood human anatomy thoroughly after months of careful study, confident enough in her knowledge that she rarely felt the need to review material she had already covered. Her confidence was shaken during a study group session when a struggling classmate asked her to explain a particular system in detail, expecting the explanation to come easily given how well Adeline believed she knew the material. Instead, she found herself stumbling through vague, incomplete descriptions, discovering gaps in her understanding that had remained completely invisible as long as she only tested herself through familiar review rather than actual explanation. The experience unsettled her enough that she began deliberately seeking out opportunities to teach material to others, not because she particularly enjoyed teaching, but because she had discovered, uncomfortably, that explanation exposed weaknesses her private studying had never revealed. Each time she attempted to teach a concept clearly to someone else, she encountered specific points where her own understanding grew fuzzy, forcing her to return to her notes and resolve confusion that silent reading had allowed her to overlook entirely. Adeline built an entire study routine around this discovery, spending the final hour of every study session explaining that day's material aloud to an empty room as though teaching a real student, forcing herself to notice every moment of hesitation or vagueness in her own explanation. Her retention of difficult material improved dramatically, not because she was spending more total hours studying, but because teaching forced a kind of clarity that passive review had never demanded of her. By the time her medical exams arrived, she found herself remembering details other students had long forgotten, simply because she had once been forced to explain those same details clearly enough for an imaginary student to understand. Understanding that cannot survive being explained to someone else was never as solid as it felt while it remained safely untested inside your own head. 3. Spacing your practice across time builds retention that cramming can never match. A young violinist named Fenwick prepared for his most important recital the way he had always prepared for performances throughout his training, cramming intense practice sessions into the final week before the concert, convinced that concentrated effort close to the performance date would produce his sharpest playing. This approach had always felt effective in the short term, his playing noticeably improving during that final frantic week. But Fenwick noticed something troubling about pieces he had performed this way months earlier. Material he had crammed so intensely before a performance seemed to vanish from his memory almost entirely within weeks afterward, as though the knowledge had never been built to last beyond the moment it was needed. His instructor, noticing this pattern across several performances, introduced Fenwick to an entirely different approach before his most important recital yet. Instead of concentrating his practice into a single intense week, he spread the same total number of practice hours across several months, revisiting the piece repeatedly at increasing intervals rather than repeatedly within a single compressed period. Fenwick resisted at first, uncomfortable with an approach that felt less urgent, less intensely productive than the frantic cramming he had always relied on. But his instructor insisted, explaining that the brain builds durable memory through spaced repetition in a way that concentrated cramming, however impressive it might feel in the moment, simply cannot replicate. Fenwick followed this spaced approach reluctantly, and the difference became clear almost immediately once the recital arrived. His playing carried a depth and reliability that his previous crammed performances had never quite achieved, and unlike those earlier pieces that had faded from memory within weeks, this piece remained sharp in his fingers and his mind for years afterward, revisited easily whenever it was requested without requiring the frantic relearning his old method had always demanded. He began applying spaced practice to every new piece from that point forward, discovering that the same total hours of effort, simply distributed differently across time, produced dramatically more durable mastery than concentrating that same effort into a single desperate stretch before a deadline. Cramming produces knowledge that performs once and disappears. Spacing produces knowledge that becomes a permanent part of who you actually are. 4. Sleep is not a pause and learning it is when learning actually consolidates. A chess player named Isadora spent her early training convinced that sleep was simply dead time stolen from the hours she could otherwise spend studying openings, memorizing tactical patterns, and reviewing past games. She regularly sacrificed sleep for extra study hours before important tournaments, believing that additional waking hours of preparation would always outweigh whatever benefits sleep might offer. Her tournament results told a more complicated story than her theory predicted. Despite consistently sacrificing sleep for extra study, her performance during tournaments following these sleep-deprived preparation periods was noticeably weaker than her performance following periods where she had, for whatever reason, actually slept normally beforehand. A sports psychologist working with her chess club finally explained something Isadora had never considered about how the brain actually processes new information. She told her that sleep is not simply a pause in learning, a neutral gap between study sessions, but an active period during which the brain consolidates and strengthens the exact patterns Isadora had spent her waking hours trying to memorize. Sacrificing sleep for additional study hours was not simply a neutral trade-off, exchanging one form of learning time for another. It was actively undermining the very consolidation process that turned her waking study into lasting, retrievable knowledge in the first place. Isadora tested this advice reluctantly before her next tournament, protecting a full night of sleep even during the final days of preparation when her old instincts screamed at her to squeeze in additional hours instead. Her performance during that tournament surprised her, tactical patterns she had studied surfacing with a clarity and speed that her sleep-deprived preparation had never produced despite requiring far more total study hours. She began treating sleep as a genuine component of her training rather than an obstacle standing between her and additional study time, and her results improved consistently once she stopped sacrificing the exact process her brain needed to actually retain everything she was working so hard to learn. The hours you spend asleep after studying are not wasted time. They are very often when the studying you already did finally becomes permanent. 5. Narrow focused practice on your specific weakness outperforms broad general review. A swimmer named Cassius spent years training with a broad, general routine, practicing every stroke and every distance in roughly equal measure, believing that well-rounded practice would naturally produce well-rounded improvement across his entire performance. His times improved slowly across this broad approach, but a particular weakness in his turns at the wall, a small technical flaw that cost him precious fractions of a second in every race, remained stubbornly unchanged year after year despite the broad practice he assumed would eventually smooth it out simply through general repetition. A new coach, reviewing Cassius's race footage carefully, identified this specific weakness within a single session and proposed something that felt uncomfortably narrow compared to the broad training Cassius had always relied on. Instead of continuing his general practice across every stroke and distance, the coach suggested Cassius dedicate a significant portion of his training specifically and exclusively to correcting this one flawed turn, drilling it repeatedly in isolation until the flaw disappeared entirely, before returning to his broader routine. Cassius resisted initially, worried that narrowing his focus so specifically would cause his broader skills to stagnate, while he obsessed over a single technical detail. He tried the approach anyway, dedicating weeks almost entirely to this one specific weakness rather than spreading his effort evenly across everything. The flaw, which had resisted years of broad general practice, corrected itself within a matter of weeks once it received this concentrated, narrow attention. More surprisingly, his overall race times improved significantly once the flaw was corrected, because that single small weakness had been quietly costing him time in every single race regardless of how strong his other skills had become. Broad practice maintains what you already know. Narrow, deliberate practice aimed directly at your specific weakness is what actually closes the gap between where you currently stand and where your potential actually allows you to reach. 6. Connecting new information to something you already deeply understand makes it unforgettable. A history student named Wilhelmina struggled for years to retain dates, names, and sequences of events, memorizing lists that felt disconnected and arbitrary, forgotten within weeks despite hours of repetitive review. Facts that felt like isolated fragments floating with nothing to anchor them slipped from her memory almost as quickly as she managed to memorize them, no matter how many times she reviewed the same lists of dates and names that other students seemed to retain with far less visible effort. A professor, noticing her frustration, asked Wilhelmina about subjects outside history that she understood deeply and effortlessly, subjects where she never struggled to retain complicated information. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she understood the layout and history of her own family's estate in intimate detail, every room, every generation that had lived there, without ever having deliberately memorized any of it. The professor pointed out something Wilhelmina had never considered. She had never memorized her family's estate as an isolated list of disconnected facts. She had absorbed it naturally because every detail connected to something else she already understood deeply, one story leading naturally into the next to relationships and context that gave each fact a place to attach itself within a larger, coherent picture. The professor suggested Wilhelmina stop memorizing historical facts as isolated items and instead deliberately connect each new fact to something she already understood well, weaving unfamiliar dates and names into a narrative anchored in context rather than treating them as disconnected fragments to be forced into memory through sheer repetition. Wilhelmina began building these connections deliberately, linking new historical figures to personality types she recognized from people in her own life, linking unfamiliar events to causes and consequences that formed a coherent story rather than an arbitrary list. Her retention transformed almost immediately, facts that once slipped away within weeks now remaining vivid and accessible months later, because they had finally been given something to hold on to rather than floating disconnected and alone. Information without connection is fragile and easily lost. Information woven into something you already understand deeply becomes remarkably difficult to forget. 7. The discipline to sit with discomfort is the skill beneath every other skill. A young monk named Cedric struggled for years to master any discipline he attempted, abandoning instruments, languages, and crafts alike the moment the initial excitement faded and the harder, more uncomfortable middle stretch of real learning arrived. He would begin each new pursuit with genuine enthusiasm, only to quit within weeks once the material grew difficult enough to require sustained effort through confusion and frustration rather than the easy early progress that had first drawn him in. He believed, for years, that his failures across so many different pursuits meant he simply lacked talent for anything requiring real mastery, unable to see the actual pattern connecting every one of his abandoned attempts. An elder at the monastery, observing this pattern across years of watching Cedric begin and abandon pursuit after pursuit, finally pointed out something Cedric had never considered about himself. He told him that his failures had nothing to do with talent for any particular skill, and everything to do with a single missing skill underlying all the others: the simple capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately fleeing from it. Every pursuit Cedric had abandoned had followed an identical pattern: easy, enthusiastic progress followed by a wall of genuine difficulty. And at that exact wall, every single time, Cedric had chosen to quit rather than sit with the discomfort long enough to push through it. The elder gave Cedric a strange assignment. Rather than starting something new, he told him to return to the very first pursuit he had abandoned years earlier and commit to sitting with the discomfort at that specific wall for a fixed period, regardless of how badly he wanted to quit or move on to something that felt easier. Cedric found this nearly unbearable at first, the old urge to abandon the pursuit screaming at him within days. But he forced himself to sit with it anyway, uncomfortable session after uncomfortable session, until something shifted. The wall that had once felt impossible slowly began to feel merely difficult, and the difficulty itself slowly began to feel less like a signal to quit and more like the ordinary texture of real learning. Cedric carried this lesson into every pursuit that followed, no longer fleeing the moment enthusiasm faded and genuine difficulty arrived, but recognizing that exact discomfort as the actual location where mastery is built rather than a signal that he had chosen the wrong pursuit entirely. This is the principle beneath all 6 that came before it, because struggle before answers, teaching to expose gaps, space practice instead of cramming, protecting sleep, narrow focus on weakness, and connecting new information to old understanding all require the same underlying capacity: the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than flee toward whatever feels easier in the moment. Every one of the other 6 principles asks something uncomfortable of you, and without the discipline to tolerate that discomfort, none of the other 6 can actually be practiced consistently enough to matter. The thread that connects all 7. Look closely at these 7 stories and notice that every single one of them required the same uncomfortable trade: choosing a harder, slower path over an easier one that felt more comfortable in the moment. Halden chose to struggle with unfamiliar problems rather than passively reviewing solved examples. Adeline chose to expose her own gaps through teaching rather than resting comfortably inside untested private understanding. Fenwick chose the patience of spaced practice over the urgent intensity of cramming. Isadora chose to protect her sleep rather than sacrificing it for additional hours that felt more immediately productive. Cassius chose narrow, uncomfortable focus on his specific weakness rather than the broader, more comfortable variety of general practice. Wilhelmina chose to deliberately build connections rather than relying on the easier, more familiar method of brute repetition. And Cedric discovered that every one of these choices depended entirely on a single underlying capacity: the discipline to sit with discomfort long enough for real learning to actually take hold. This is the actual reason some people learn anything faster than 99% of everyone else attempting the same material, and it has almost nothing to do with natural talent or inherited intelligence. It has everything to do with a willingness to choose the harder, more uncomfortable path consistently, session after session, long after the initial enthusiasm that made learning feel easy has faded into the genuine difficulty that separates people who master something from people who simply dabble in it before quitting. The mind that has trained itself to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it gains access to every one of the other 6 principles, while the mind that has never developed this capacity will abandon every one of them the moment they demand something uncomfortable, which, without exception, they always eventually will. Master yourself first, and the capacity to learn anything else becomes simply a matter of applying principles that were always available to you, waiting patiently for a mind disciplined enough to actually use them. Please subscribe for more.